Hi, welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Let's talk about ganja. Yeah, Stacy.
Max, everybody is legalizing ganja around the world. You know, now that Colorado has legalized marijuana, following on Uruguay, and now Peru wants to legalize it, New York State is now saying that they want to legalize it, so it's a mass rush. It's like Marley's heaven, and he must be controlling this from heaven, in fact. But as marijuana stocks hit record highs, they're all booming.
Rastaman vibrations, yo, Rastaman.
I never
you
heard
get a big
one.
Jiffy Pop hat.
Yeah.
You know, and get some dreads. I'm gonna get some dreads. And one of them big African-colored, Jamaican-colored, you know, Jiffy Pop hats with a big spleef, man. A big spleef. We'd be like Cheech and Chong.
Woo.
Stacy and
ganja,
Max.
Ganja.
Oh, we get zooted, man.
Woo, ganja, ganja. So, as cannabis is widely legalized, China cashes in on an unprecedented boom. There you go,
well,
China
of course,
once
China.
again.
Yeah, they love to, you know, they got a lot of good smoke in China, man. You know, Panama Red's got nothing on that Chinese whack-whack.
So here we have again, listen to this very first words of this article describing China cashing in on yet another boom, cashing in on yet another boom, China cashing in.
You might be high right now. I'm thinking, I just heard you say the same thing 3 times. So whatever you put into that oatmeal this morning has got me completely wasted.
The communist country, the communist country that's always cashing in, right? The communist country is well placed to exploit the burgeoning cannabis trade, with more than half of the patents relating to or involving cannabis originating in China. According to the World Intellectual Property Organization, Chinese firms have filed 309 of the 606 patents relating to the drug. So apparently 147 million people, they claim, around the world do smoke marijuana. That's about 2.5% of the world's population. I'm sure it's much higher, but here there's not only demand for recreational use, but there's a huge demand in medical terms, which has gone as yet unfilled because apparently Americans prefer opium.
Well, I think this is interesting in that if China tries to claim copyright or trademark or patent protection on the cannabis seeds that they are growing, I mean, this would be a very big reversal on what we've seen in the last 20 years with China is basically engaged in patent pilfering. You know, and they've been stealing patents and intellectual property and trademarks for decades now. And Hollywood's been fighting them, and the drug companies have been fighting them. So it's interesting now that they're saying, well, we've got half the patents or more on THC, on cannabis, and then we're going to exploit this this intellectual property monopoly, and we're going to make sure that when everyone gets high in the world, that they see a big frickin' Chinese flag that's going to be bioengineered into the ganja, is that whenever you smoke Chinese dope, you're going to see Mao Zedong over there with his big bald head smoking a spliff.
You know, there's a thing called traditional Chinese medicine, and it's all herbal based, or I think in the UK they say herbal. But you know, it's all, so it's their research in that. And one of the things they specialize in terms of the cannabis, cannabis. You
gotta put down the weed, man, because your ability to articulate is severely impaired.
But one of them that they're really focusing on is constipation, which Americans might need some relief from constipation if they eat all those munchies, food that is not quite good for you. It's all that processed food.
Well, now I understand why there was an urgency to buy Twinkies. You remember Twinkies went bankrupt and they were bought by a private equity fund. Twinkies, of course, a classic munchie food, post-high munchie food. Get a big, you know, box of Twinkies, and it does cause constipation. So I guess they're going to try to have both the going in and coming out market over there in China.
Well, Peter Reynolds, who's the leader of the cannabis law reform here in the UK, says, quote, that the Chinese are smarter and they are on to all the good ideas. The potential for cannabis as a medicine is monumental. But, you know, we've missed out on it here, and we've missed out on it in the UK, in the US, and apparently China has all the patents.
Well, I think that would explain Boris Johnson's trip recently when he's up in that helicopter flying over various Chinese cities. What they didn't see in that photo was a big bag of ganja, which he was obviously taking copious quantities up there in the helicopter while he's getting blasted touring various Chinese cities saying, you know what, we're going to have a big field back in number 10 Downing Street of some of the finest dope possible in the UK.
Actually, to smoke it recreationally in China is against the law, and you face very long prison sentences. However, they are the world's leader in industrial hemp, so they grow that industrially for traditional Chinese medicine. They've always used it medicinally, which the U.S. that's how they enter the market. So New York, for example, is allowing medicinal marijuana, not recreational marijuana, but this is the first move.
The Chinese seem awfully confused about what's medicinal and what's not, and what's available in the pharmaceutical section of your supermarket. I mean, they've got Viagra, and yet they still go after, you know, a rhino horn for erectile dysfunction, driving the rhino to extinction. When all they just get that little blue pill, Mr. Chinese man, okay? You don't need to go kill a rhino to you know, get a spliff and get a little blue pill, and you're set for the weekend. Don't go kill a rhino. You don't need to be killing rhinos anymore. Get your head out of your frickin' I Ching and wake up to the 21st century.
So there you have it. China will rule the world in terms of cannabis production, and it's a great way because, of course, you know, you smoke one spliff and you need another within half an hour.
Oh my God, see the connection to Chinese food. Wow, I'd be buying pork buns. I'm going long pork buns.
But I wanted to, the neighboring state of Wyoming, their state troopers already warned people not to drive into their state carrying cannabis that they bought legally in Colorado. So I wanted to turn to another story, an interesting story out of Wyoming that is a real tale for what the UK, which is going to allow fracking, what to look for here. Because of course they won't allow recreational use of marijuana, but they'll allow fracking. Fracking wells abandoned in boom-bust cycle. Who will pay to cap them? The companies that once operated the wells in Wyoming have all but vanished into the prairie, many seeking bankruptcy protection and unable to pay the cost of reclaiming the land they leased. Recent estimates have put the number of abandoned drilling operations in Wyoming at more than 1,200, and state officials said several thousand more might soon be orphaned by their operations. So here's Wyoming, ground zero for fracking. They were one of the first to introduce this because, of course, Dick Cheney was the former senator there. He's from Wyoming. And there, from the photo here, you can see fracking wells. Those are abandoned fracking wells, thousands of them across Wyoming. The companies who left them, who abandoned these wells, have declared bankruptcy so they don't have to clean up the cost. All the farmers are complaining because their land is being toxic, is toxic. And so the state, the taxpayer, is having to clean it up. They reckon $8 million just for those 1,200 abandoned wells. There's thousands more to come.
Right. Well, this is a classic corporate predatory behavior. They knew going into the whole industry that they would be declaring bankruptcy once they fracked and they exhausted all the gas that they could through the fracking. And they declare bankruptcy, and therefore they're not responsible for the cleanup. They know that going in. That's what they tell investors on the private memo that says, look, we're never going to ever clean up. I know we signed contracts saying we will clean up, but we're going to declare bankruptcy well before we need to clean up. We won't spend a penny cleaning up. This is actually an unintended consequences of artificially low interest rates, because the return to these investors, when it all works out after tax and after cost, they're making about 5%. Return on investment. And why do they even bother with a 5% return on investment? Because the Federal Reserve Bank keeps rates at near zero. The Bank of England keeps rates near zero. So let's flash forward to the ghost of Christmas future here in the UK. You've got the rates near zero. You've got people with a lot of money, thanks to artificially pumping it with money printing, like Chinese investors, who are looking to make 5% on their money because they can't get 5% on a government bond like they would unless if the Bank of England was not artificially keeping rates low. So they put money into a fracking rig, and they sign bogus contracts that say, yes, we'll be doing the cleanup. They won't. Yes, it's environmentally sound. It isn't. Yes, it's economically viable. It's not. And yes, it will supply energy for X number of years into the future. That's a lie. It's a pure 24 to 36 month scam to make 5% on money that was gifted to them from the corrupt Mark Carney at the Bank of England to begin with. And it will result in ecological holocaust. Who cares? More debt to the UK economy. Oh, so what? and other consequences that will result in lifestyle being degraded, more cancer. You gotta love cancer. Go long cancer, UK, because you're about to get a whole bunch of it because of these fracking rigs doing low artificially interest rates. Yeah, you love cancer. Your kid's got leukemia. You love it, don't you? Because you're making 5%. What a bunch of losers.
Well, actually, there's one UK medical marijuana company, and they deal with a drug specifically designed for cancer. So they could work hand in hand. Now, these people that push still this toxic sort of fracking, which has no economic sense, is, for example, in Wyoming. This guy, State Senator John J. Hines, a Republican who represents mineral-rich Campbell and Converse counties, said it was vital for lawmakers to take up the issue swiftly because natural gas was so important to Wyoming's economy. He himself has 40 abandoned rigs on his own property, which the company went bankrupt, Patriot Resource Company. They went bankrupt and left these 40 rigs. So he's looking for state funds to clean up his toxic mess on his own. But he's like, hi, he still doesn't see that it's a problem. He's like, we need more of this.
Right, Dick Cheney is a socialist. His daughter, Lynn, I believe her name is, she's dropped out of the Senate race in Wyoming because she's gonna now open up a socialist, ashram where she's going to pray to the god of socialism, which she clearly is an adherent to. They don't work for a living. They extract wealth, whether it's from the bank, where they drain money freely at 0%, or from the earth using fracking. They don't pay for the fracking. They don't pay for the rigs, they don't pay for the land, and they never pay for the cleanup. They're just extracting the ecological resources to the point of economic suicide. There's like Cheney and his daughter are like having Charles Manson run your energy policy and your economy in your country. They're suicide cultists. They're nightmarish kleptocrats dressed up as politicians that are unfortunately the face of a neoliberal model that has driven American commerce to the point of only thing having left is smoking dope all day. Why don't they just rename the country the United States of Jamaica?
Well, and finally here, on these cleanup costs that the government promises, Margaret Thatcher, speaking of neoliberalism, brought in this nuclear energy and promised that the cleanup costs would either be, well, the private companies would do it, but then the state took over, and now the state is paying more and more and more. Sellafield cleanup cost reaches £67.5 billion, says the report. That was earlier in the year. It's now $70 billion already. This is the taxpayer paying for the cleanup of nuclear waste with no sign of when the cost will stop rising, according to the report. In Fukushima, it's $150 billion so far. They have nuclear gypsies that go in there and clean up because they're certain to be dead soon.
Yeah. Well, once again, it's the economics of suicide, brought to you by the leaders of Japan, UK, and the United States, who all have the same economic policy of 0% interest rates to fund kleptocracy and cancer provocation through fracking. And the UK public and the Japanese public and the American public can't wait to get cancer. That's their goal in life. Mazel tov! All right, we got to go. Bye.
Woo, ganja, ganja.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Colorado and speak with the Don Draper of pot, Mason Tvert, Director of Communications for the Marijuana Policy Project, which helped pass the Colorado's recent marijuana legislation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Mason, tell us about Colorado's new marijuana law. What is actually allowed under the law?
Well, Amendment 64, which about 55% of voters adopted back in November 2012, allows adults 21 and older to possess up to 1 ounce of marijuana and to grow up to 6 plants in their homes. It also established a state-regulated system of licensed marijuana businesses that cultivate, distribute marijuana, and produce products and test marijuana. Essentially, it's a system very similar to alcohol, in which adults can legally purchase marijuana with a driver's license or other government-issued ID and not fear arrest.
All right, so now there are already reports of shortages of marijuana, and so prices rising to $400 an ounce. Where is supply coming from? Who is allowed to grow? Clearly there's a market inefficiency there or not. Talk about that a little bit.
I don't think that there's necessarily a market inefficiency quite yet. A limited number of these businesses have opened. Only about 35 to 37 businesses around the state opened. We're expecting to see anywhere from 150 or up. Also, a lot of people don't even know where these businesses are yet. So the competition is going to grow as more of these businesses open and more people are able to access more businesses and the competition sets in. Also, a lot of these businesses are still covering the overhead costs associated with licensing fees and complying with all of these new rules and regulations. So, right now the prices are generally right around where they would be in the underground market in a lot of states, but most adults would prefer to buy marijuana in a legal, safe place instead of in the underground market. And I think that it's not going to be very long before we eliminate that underground market.
All right. Now, Mason, only a decade ago, 2/3 of Americans were against legalizing marijuana. 10 years later, the numbers are completely reversed, largely due to your efforts. How did you do it?
Well, I think a big part of changing marijuana laws has been changing public attitudes. And ultimately what that comes down to is getting people to understand that marijuana is just not as harmful as they were once led to believe. Our federal government and others have exaggerated the harms of marijuana for years to keep it illegal. But the fact is, marijuana is objectively less harmful than alcohol. It's less toxic, it's less addictive, and it doesn't contribute to violence and aggressive behavior like alcohol does. And as more and more people come to recognize that fact, they simply don't think it's a good idea to prohibit it. It's just as foolish as alcohol prohibition was.
Right. Now let's talk about some of these other numbers here in Colorado. What is the tax rate on marijuana? How much do you expect to sell in 2014? And what sort of revenue does the state expect?
The tax rate was set by voters here in Colorado. There's a 15% excise tax on wholesale sales. So that would be between a cultivation facility and a retail store, for example. The first $40 million from that each year goes towards the state's public school construction program. There's also a 10% special sales tax at the point of sale, which is really there to ensure that enough money is being generated to cover the costs of enforcing the regulatory system and funding that section of the Department of Revenue. And then there's standard state and local sales taxes and any other local taxes that might apply. So for example, in Colorado, you're essentially paying about 20% at the register. And the state has projected we will generate about $70 million annually in the first year based on these sales. That's in tax revenue alone. We expect to see about $400 million in retail sales, about $600 or $700 million overall, including wholesale sales. So it's going to be a big market, and it's going to generate a lot of revenue.
Now, do you have any idea how much of the cost savings there will be once criminal enforcement is no longer a requirement? So that's another huge economic piece of the puzzle here. The enforcement on the criminal side is no longer required to some degree. So what are the cost savings there?
According to the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, which did an analysis prior to this initiative passing, about $12 million in savings would be accrued each year. Ultimately, the most important thing is that law enforcement officials will be able to focus their time on, more serious crimes as opposed to arresting adults and prosecuting them simply for possessing marijuana. About anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 adults each year in Colorado were being arrested simply for marijuana possession. That number has completely dwindled almost to nothing. So, ultimately, this is going to be a huge benefit simply in the fact that we can redirect our law enforcement efforts toward other things.
Right, and so the trend seems to be growing. I just saw that New York is now talking about medicinal marijuana, which seems to be kind of the gateway into more of a legalized structure. So is this now going to be going to other states? I would imagine if Colorado is going to be raising a lot of revenue here and saving money on law enforcement, other states are going to look at this quite enviously, and this could be a wave going coast to coast. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think lawmakers and voters in states around the country are watching what's happening in Colorado. They're seeing that regulating marijuana works. It's got a lot of benefits. It's certainly preferable to alcohol prohibition. And, as you alluded to earlier in the program, about 58% of Americans now think marijuana should be legal. So we expect to see a number of states pass these laws over the next few years, several of which will be through ballot initiatives. We also expect to start seeing some through state legislatures legislatures as lawmakers increasingly recognize that this is not the taboo subject it once was, and that their constituents want to see these changes.
I mean, it's interesting how this is going to play into, I guess, what is called the culture wars in America. You've got, certainly on the right conservative side of the political spectrum, a certain vested interest in keeping certain elements of this from getting more popular. What are we going to see going forward there? Is there going to be basically a triumph, if you will, of this type of thinking and a disappearing of some of these entrenched culture warriors who have been very anti-marijuana for years? If that question makes sense, I hope it does. What do you think?
You know, I mean, ultimately, I think it comes down to this. You know, marijuana is something that's been used by people from all walks of life for years and years. There are a lot of people who use marijuana who would fall into the subculture of marijuana enthusiasts that come to mind when many people think of a marijuana user. But there are also millions and millions of people who don't. For example, our last 3 presidents have used marijuana. At least one of our Supreme Court justices has used marijuana. Countless successful people use marijuana. They're conservatives, they're liberals, Democrats, Republicans. This is a substance that millions of people use, most of which for the same reasons that people enjoy having a cocktail or a beer after work. It's relaxing, or it's just a matter of socializing with friends. And of course, for many, it's a therapeutic thing.
Right, you mentioned the last 3 presidents using marijuana. I think the first 3 presidents were also using marijuana. I believe George Washington cultivated this crop at some point. Why are you, in Colorado, do you only accept cash, and I believe also Bitcoin in some cases, but why only cash?
Well, unfortunately, right now, this is largely a cash business because these marijuana businesses are not able to get financial services. A lot of banks are very concerned about the prospect of being prosecuted for engaging in money laundering because marijuana is still illegal. This is an issue, and it's one that's fortunately starting to be addressed by our federal government. Earlier this past year, in August and September, the Department of Justice made it clear during a Senate hearing that they are now talking to banking regulators and the Treasury Department to address this, because whether or not you support marijuana being legal, the fact is, if it is legal, we need to ensure these businesses are not carrying around tens of thousands of dollars at a time. They need to be able to pay their bills. They need to be able to maintain public safety, and that's really what this is about. So we expect to see that issue get addressed administratively here in the near future. Fortunately, some of these businesses are able to get banks, but far too many of them are not right now. So it's really that's one of the most pressing issues.
Yeah, just getting back to the culture war aspect of this a little bit. So I saw one comment recently from somebody in Washington suggesting that wide-scale use of marijuana would diminish America's competitiveness against the Chinese. You know, suggesting that somehow this was going to cut into America's ability to compete with China. I think I've got my thoughts on that, but what are your thoughts?
I think it's completely unfounded. Again, millions of Americans have been using marijuana for years and years. About 50% of all Americans, and that's a conservative figure, have tried marijuana. And ultimately, there's no actual evidence that it has any impact on people's motivation or ability to get their jobs done. In fact, there is a lot of evidence showing the lack of productivity that results from alcohol use. Obviously, anyone who's shown up at work with a hangover knows that they probably get a little bit less done in the day than had they not. Well, marijuana doesn't cause hangovers. So there's one specific area in which we're not going to see any sort of loss of productivity. But, again, marijuana is not new. It's been used by people in the United States and around the world for a very, very long time. And there's absolutely no reason to expect things would change in that manner.
On the commercial side of things, what about a company like a Philip Morris or the major tobacco companies? Are we going to see a day when you walk into your local store and they'll be selling marijuana cigarettes right alongside their other offerings? Are the big corporations going to get into this in a big way? Your thoughts?
I think it's unlikely it'll happen anytime soon, if at all. Suggesting that tobacco companies get into this would be no different than suggesting companies that grow oranges get into this. I mean, that's just not what they do. They don't grow marijuana indoors or in greenhouses. This is not a product they're familiar with, and this is also an intrastate business right now. I don't see a lot of interest among massive companies like that wanting to get into it. There's also a lot of regulations in place that prohibit out-of-state businesses from owning businesses here in Colorado. You can't transfer money from this industry or products across state lines. So, there's a lot of things that are going to prevent that. What we are going to see are some of the businesses involved growing, much like we have seen alcohol companies grow. For example, in Colorado, we've got Coors. We've got New Belgium, which was a very prominent craft brewing company that has now finally, after years, expanded its reach out of the state. And then we've got small craft breweries and brew pubs, and they're all able to be successful. We expect to see a similar type of situation with marijuana. And quite frankly, marijuana doesn't kill people. So if tobacco companies did get into this, it wouldn't be the end of the world. It'd probably be a net positive.
All right, fair enough. Mason, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Mason Tvert of the Marijuana Policy Project. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.